myself or getting feedback, but we'll just go live first and then we'll introduce the first guest. Myself or getting feedback. All right, so everyone, tonight we're talking compost, and joining us is Gabby from Keep Austin Beautiful, and she's going to be speaking first about composting, and then followed will be Kate from the Compost Queens, and she's going to be talking about the Bukashi method. And so each panel will be 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And feel free to ask your questions in the chat at any point. But yeah, with that, I'll have Gabby take it away.
Sweet. Well, hello. My name is Gabby Benitez. I use she, her, and ella pronouns. And yeah, I'm the education programs manager at Keep Austin Beautiful. So if you're familiar with Keep Austin Beautiful, we do all sorts of things. A lot of it you may be familiar with in terms of like litter cleanups around town or restoration work. But within our education programs, we talk a lot about both, keeping our creeks and our watershed clean, and then also reducing our waste. And one component of our Generation Zero Waste programming is our sort of like vermicomposting. So it's been a little bit of a weird year in terms of being virtual. And so unfortunately, I don't have worms to show you today. Normally we teach with our worms and get to take them into the classroom and actually get worm bins out to schools here in the Austin area, but I'm still going to talk us through a little bit of vermicomposting, and then sort of at the end, I'll also talk a little bit about just like other composting resources in Austin as well. But I can go ahead and, is it possible for me to share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to share your screen as a co-host. Okay. And if you aren't muted, go ahead and mute yourself at this moment.
Okay, 1 second. Sorry. Let's see. I think I'm going to try this, and y'all are just going to have to let me know if you can actually see. I think you're going to be able to. Can you see a slideshow presentation?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. Let me present this. Here we go. So yeah, I'll talk about some vermicomposting, also known as worm composting. The word worm means talking about worm, vermiculture, right? Taking care of worms. Definitely when I was kind of thrown into this, because I was just a team member at Keep Austin Beautiful, there was a lot of just like language I had to learn. So I think sometimes it's helpful, when we're coming into it, like having some of those things defined. And so just sort of like some basic information. I know there are some vermicomposters in the room, so I'm sure there's a lot of expertise here. But for those of y'all who are not super familiar with worm composting, it does have some really great benefits. And so for one, like you can really make it a pretty small little production if you want to, so it can be pretty space efficient. You can do it indoors. So if you don't, have like a backyard or a porch space, it's something that you can do just like in your home. You can also do it outdoors. I'll probably be talking
about composting.
I'll be talking mostly about how to do indoor worm composting, but I'll talk a little bit about outdoor composting as well. It doesn't smell, or at least it shouldn't smell. If it is starting to smell a little bit, you can just kind of adjust things in your bin a bit to reduce that smell. But generally it's like super low maintenance, very chill, fairly self-maintaining. And so your end production, right? So as we work with kids, right, what we talk about is like worms, turn food into soil. And how do they do that? Well, they poop it out, right? So that worm castings, or also just worm poop, right, actually provides really nutrient rich, like very high quality compost that then you can, use as a soil amendment, or you can also make compost tea out of it. So it's like a really high quality product. Again, it's pretty low maintenance. And then also, like, if you have little ones around, I will say, like, a benefit of vermicomposting is it's super entertaining. It's a great teaching tool as well. Yeah, it's, as someone who teaches with worms, I can tell you, like, the worms are always going to be a hit. Great distraction also. The cons, I will say, are like, worms are somewhat selective feeders, so you can't compost some things in your worm bin that, you know, you may actually be using a lot of, like, in your kitchen. I know I cook with, like, onion and garlic a ton. Dairy and meat can't go in there either, and then also citrus. So a lot of these things are going to be kind of like either too, like, smelly, kind of too strong for the worms, or they're not going to be able to break it down safely. Because unlike, you know, some of our industrial composting, which is going to raise the temperature of the compost to high enough levels where the bacteria in the compost bin are going to actually die, the ones that kind of come from breaking down dairy and meat, which makes that compost product a safe product at the end. That's not going to happen in your worm bin. It's going to stay pretty moderate. And then worms do take a little bit of time. So I will say it's not going to be like a super high volume of compost, at least not like a very quick kind of turnover. And depending on the scale you're doing it at as well, you're not going to necessarily, be able to just like compost everything and kind of have a huge load at the end of it. So one thing that some folks may not realize is that if you're doing worm composting, you're going to want to be using a very specific kind of worm, which is the California red wiggler worm. I know I get questions sometimes of like, well, is that then introducing an invasive species, et cetera? That California red wiggler is very suited to California and like specific areas there. And so here in Texas, you know, one thing that we tell our students is like, we're not trying to set the worms free, because if you set them free, if you put them outside in your garden, they're not going to do very well, right? That's not their habitat. And these California red wiggler worms are really great composters because they're more social. So they're able to live in a very close quarters with one another. When you're looking at your worm bin, you know, your worms are generally going to be like in a kind of little spaghetti tangle together. The earthworms, for example, that we have out here are fairly solitary. So even though they're doing the same work, you know, they're not doing it in a concentrated area. So these California red wiggler worms, you can take a lot of them, put them in a bin, and they're going to work together to break that down. I have some recommendations for where you can buy worms. And I'm like, if other folks have ideas along this route as well, that'd be great. We've gotten our worms in the past from here in Austin, Bright Ideas, which is like an organic gardening space or store. Sometimes their supply is not that high, so we've had to outsource as well. More recently, we've gotten worms from Arbico Organics, and then those come shipped and you have to, I think, rehydrate them. But it's generally works out pretty well. And then I know Uncle Jim's Worm Farm is another place. I've personally not ordered from them. So if anyone has any thoughts on that front, happy to hear it. And then in the past, Keep Austin Beautiful has been a source of worms and sort of like pre-made worm bins for teachers or educators in the area. So like fingers crossed in fall 21 or spring 22, that may also be a resource here. So I'm like, you know, check back in with me if you're a teacher or someone doing education with worms in the future. Hopefully that's something we can get to you. So really basically like how to build kind of an indoor worm bin. We've really just used sort of like cheap plastic containers from the Container Store, Walmart, Target, etc. Something that's not transparent so that it's not letting light into the bin, which is going to kind of irritate your worms. And you can see up in the corner here, there's a photo of someone drilling holes into one of those bins. So you're going to have that container. I have some sort of like size recommendations here, but I will say that as is with most things in the garden and with composting, like it's also a little trial and error. So I've had a lot of success with more of like a half pound of worms in about a 4 or 5 gallon container. And then having, maybe a 10-gallon container for twice or more than that in terms of worms. But again, it's like you're going to have to kind of see what works for you and go from there. But once you have that container, you want to make sure that there's airflow in that bin. So the way that we normally do it is we either like punch, or if you have a drill fairly small holes. You don't necessarily want your worms to be able to crawl out of those holes. So drill them in the sides, and then also some in the top of the bin, as long as there's like not too much light entering, so that oxygen can enter the environment, like super important. And then you want to add moisture as well. So generally what I've done, some people will take like a bucket of water and dip some newspaper scraps, like shredded newspaper or another bedding that you may choose to use, and kind of dip that in that water and then wring it out. You essentially want the environment to be like a damp sponge. So not like super soggy. You don't kind of want to drown your worms. You also don't want it to be too dry, because then they'll dry out. And so I normally just have like a spray bottle with water, spray down the newspaper so that it's damp. Because also if you have, I normally use shredded newspaper as bedding. If you have it dry, then those worms are also going to stick to it and die, unfortunately. So spray down that newspaper, probably just checking on it, for 30 minutes once a week to maybe like feed and make sure that the moisture level is right. And then you're pretty good to go. And then this last piece, just food. So their food is going to be a combination of your bedding, which again, I just generally use shredded newspaper, but you can also use things like, straw or leaves, even something that is technically going to be like that carbon material that they're eating. And that's also what you're going to want to cover your like wet food. So your food scraps, you would add probably about like 3 pounds of food scraps once a week for like a half pound of worms. They can eat like half their body weight, kind of on a daily basis. So if you do the math, kind of figuring that out. But again, you're going to have to trial and error it a little bit to see, how quickly your worms are eating, making sure that it's not just ending up, dumping too much food into that bin. When you put in the food, again, so that it doesn't smell, you want to make sure that if you don't already have some soil in there, in which case, like I would say, kind of bury the food in the soil. You want to make sure that you cover it with that newspaper so that it doesn't really smell, and that way the worms can kind of get to it very easily. And so it's pretty simple. This is generally really like what we do when we come to a classroom. We bring a container with holes in it. We have students like help us prepare the little, shredded newspaper food. We put it in there, we wet it down, and then we put a handful of worms in there, and then maybe an apple core, and that's kind of like getting it started. But obviously, the maintenance is maybe a little bit of a trickier piece, and so I'll talk some more about that too. But once you build your worm or your worm bin, you're eventually going to add worms, and I'll get to that too. I wanted to talk a little bit about outdoor worm composting. It's a similar process, but obviously you can kind of scale up when you're outdoors. Some examples of like bins that you may have are more of like a trunk kind of situation, like you can see down here, or sort of like a vertical bin. And we'll talk a little bit more about how worms kind of eat and how to harvest the compost. But one like fairly popular way to do this is to have sort of a vertical stacking bin, so that essentially you're adding worms, you're adding food, and over time the worms are going to move upwards in the bin, following the food and kind of leaving the worm castings or compost behind. The biggest thing kind of about outdoor composting, I will say, is going to be temperature. So generally, if you have something like in wood, right, it's going to be fairly temperature regulated, unless, we have like hard winters or snowstorms in the middle of February, right? So definitely like watch out for temperature. I would say probably don't put it in the middle of the sun, put it in a shady space where the temperature is going to be pretty consistent throughout the day. But worms really are happy in sort of like a 55 to about like 75-ish temperature range Fahrenheit. And they're probably going to be pretty active on like the warmer end of that spectrum too. But obviously if it gets too hot, then that's not going to be ideal. And so, yeah, once you have your bin, once you have kind of the materials that you're starting with, you're going to go ahead and add your worms. I will say that one of the things about adding worms to a bin, when you start with fresh worms in a bin, I've definitely, come back the next day and open the bin only to see what looks like a horror film in front of me, where like all of the worms are just like emerging, crawling out. It's really a bit distressing, and that's, I think, fairly standard. Like the worms are taking some time to kind of adjust to their new home. So it's really a bit of like putting them back in, kind of, adding more of whatever materials, the bedding, etc. And I've definitely, in my experience, it's sometimes been like a couple of days of just doing that. And then eventually they're going to readjust and stay in the bin. But yeah, there's definitely some time where they might just kind of try to escape the bin, and it's a little bit distressing, but pretty standard. Pictures so that y'all can get some more kind of visuals of what our bins look like. Sorry, these are all sort of like pictures taken while teaching, but if you can see, like in this picture in the back, we've got our worm bin. So you can see the shape. You can see how our teacher in this photo is, spraying water on the newspaper, right? And then here's some just examples of us kind of teaching, bringing those worms out into the classroom as well. And so this bottom picture here is also like a little image of one of our bigger bins that we would use too. And so you can really, again, use whatever size works for you, and then just kind of scale your worm amount accordingly. And so once you like have your bin kind of established, and maybe they're no longer just like trying to escape every morning or every day, then you can like start, the whole process, right? So I would say just like first, give your worms some time to kind of eat, and schedule up or set a schedule that's like going to be good for you when it comes to harvesting that compost. And so depending on how quickly your worms are eating things, breaking things down, again, which might depend on how happy they are, what the temperature is, wait somewhere between 2 to 6 months probably before really harvesting that finished compost if you want any sort of substantial amount. There are a couple of harvesting methods. And so the worm compost, the castings are like pretty obvious once you have them. They're like really deep brown, dark color, pretty fine, nice and moist, like look like the most incredible compost ever. And so once you kind of start seeing that and there's enough of it to where you can really effectively harvest, there are a couple of methods that you can do for this. So one is just what we call sort of like the dump and sort, which is exactly what it sounds like. You can spread out a tarp, newspaper, whatever. Actually, yeah, not newspaper, a tarp, some sort of plastic, maybe a table. Dump your worm bin out and then sort out, I would say like worms and any bedding material out of that, and then hold on to the worm castings. Can be really fun. If you have a little one nearby, like having them just like look for worms in a pile of dirt, it's a great activity. But another thing that you can do in order to harvest your soil is while you're kind of building your bin and adding food into the bin, you can do what's called like a side to side sorting method. This is personally my favorite. So when you are setting up your bin, you're gonna have, when you add new food, adding that new food, like your food scraps, to one side of the bin. So over time, the worms are moving from the other side towards that food. And then they're gonna leave behind like the finished castings. So then you can just kind of go in and take stuff from one side and then start over and have them migrate back to the other side. Another thing that you can do is really just like open up a bin. I think this is just maybe like a method that I've used when I've had to like really get some quick compost. Open up the bin, let it kind of be exposed to light for maybe 10 minutes. The worms will migrate down and then you can kind of like scoop off some of the fresh compost from the top. But yeah, then you've got some really nice castings. You can apply them, you can use them in your garden, again, as a soil amendment, mixing it in with some soil or make some compost tea. And then you can repeat it. So yeah, kind of figuring out a schedule that works for you to let the worms, do their thing. Worms over time, will also replicate, they're gonna reproduce. And so if you start having a ton of worms in that, compost bin, and it seems like some of them are even starting to flee your bin a little bit, you can even then start a new bin with some of those worms. And they take, some months before they start getting kind of like reproductively mature, but then they'll actually start reproducing fairly quickly. And you'll see like tiny little baby worm cocoons and then little baby worms in there as well. And so here are just some examples, some more worms, kind of, you can see like some of the shredded newspaper in here that's kind of getting mixed in. This is from a really large worm bin. You can see we've got like a yummy spaghetti squash in there that they're having a great time with. And again, normally we use mostly newspaper, but here you can also see some like straw in there as another source of bedding. And then these are just some things that like may come up. I'm happy to talk about like others because definitely some things can go wrong, some things can be a little weird. And so like for one, yeah, if your worm bin just starts getting kind of smelly, it probably is a sign that you have like a little bit too many food scraps in there and you're not letting your worms kind of catch up. So, take some of that out, put it in a different compost if you can. And then also make sure that your scraps, again, are covered by the newspaper bedding. That's really going to help with the smell. And that's also going to help with fruit flies, which are unfortunately definitely like an issue for many of us. But yeah, so that's kind of one thing to do there. It also, if it starts smelling like really weird, like super acidic or something like that, it might be that the pH is kind of off in your worm bin. And so in that case, I would, try to maybe, again, like add more newspaper, maybe scale back on your food scraps too, to kind of neutralize some of that. If your worms, again, I kind of talked about this, if your worms are really like escaping in huge amounts, like fleeing the bin, again, if you've just introduced them, it's probably pretty normal. Keep putting them back in as much as you can. But again, sometimes this can also be an indicator that like, things are not quite right in that worm bin. So check to see if it's like kind of dry in there, if it's too wet, readjust that moisture. Luckily, that's a pretty easy thing to do. Some other things, if soldier fly larvae or flies, and I'll show a picture of these in a moment, if these start appearing, like if big flies start like buzzing out of your worm bin and you start seeing some like weird kind of like, wiggling grub looking things in there, that's not like that great of a thing to have going on. So I would say like if you have capacity to, try to like hand remove the larva and get rid of that. If you have chickens, they're going to have the best time of their lives. Soldier flies are actually awesome composters, but unfortunately they will disrupt the like little ecosystem in your bin. So if you have those and they continue to do their thing, it's going to probably end up killing your worms. And so, something you want to kind of take control of as soon as possible if you're able to. Another thing, like I definitely, when I first was working with worms, I started seeing some like tiny little things that looked like scorpions in the bin and I was kind of freaking out, but these are called pseudoscorpions. Yeah, I think they're rad. They're also, again, great worm companions. So they're helping break down that food in order for the worms to compost better. Another thing you might see in there are different kind of varieties of mites. I would say if like they're not covering everything, don't worry about it too much. But those can definitely become an issue if they start competing with the worms for food, or if they're like little red mites, then those can also actually like kind of prey on your worms, which is not ideal. And then for outdoor composting, if you see fire ants near or kind of in your bin, yeah, I would say panic. A fire ant kind of invasion is really going to destroy your worm bin. So if it's not too late, relocate, you know, find some way to safely and non-hazardously get rid of those fire ants, because otherwise, yeah, it's really going to get rid of your worms, unfortunately. But yeah, some examples here. This is a huge blown up picture of a pseudoscorpion. They're like, I don't know, millimeters small, so super tiny, but very cool. And then, yeah, here's the black soldier fly. This is what the adult looks like. And these are kind of what those little larvae look like. They're actually not, yeah, they're fairly large. I would say they're maybe like half an inch or so. So there's something that you can actually pretty easily see if you're sorting through your bin, but obviously if you've got like a gigantic bin, it's probably not worth the time and painstaking effort in order to do that. I did want to talk about a couple of other composting resources in Austin. So I know not all folks are here in Austin at the moment, but if you are, and you know, worm composting is maybe not your thing, here in Austin, the curbside composting program, which is that little green bin that most of us who live like at a residential address, if you're a service customer of the Austin Resource Recovery, then you should have your green bin. And so I just have kind of this little chart in here because some people are surprised by how much can be composted in that green bin. And so again, it really like runs the gamut like of everything that you can pretty much put in there, aside from, you know, lots of oils, grease, plastic, obviously glass, metal, styrofoam. So things that are not like organic materials that are going to actually decompose. But yeah, just kind of wanted to share that in case people are not super familiar with their program. And I'm sure most of you are also aware of this if you're here in Austin, but Austin Resource Recovery also does have a home composting program. So you can take the city's home composting class and get a $75 rebate on a backyard composter. I know that they have some specific kind of models. I think one of them is sort of like the rotating drum compost. So those are some options too, if you're really trying to compost, but maybe worms aren't your thing, or there are, you know, or you don't necessarily want to build a backyard compost pile. I will say, like, if you've got backyard space, really awesome if you can kind of build a big backyard compost, although yes, like you can't compost meats, dairy, oil, and it also is probably going to be a little smelly and may attract some, you know, neighborhood raccoons and all that jazz. And then I also wanted to share, I know there are a lot of folks I know who maybe like aren't home enough to kind of maintain a composter, or, you know, are living in an apartment and don't have the curbside compost option. There are also some places here in the city where you can take your compost, check in with your local community garden. If you're really trying again to reduce your waste, here in Austin, the city's zero waste program is trying to divert 90% of what's going to the landfill into recycling and composting. So there are ways to do that, whether or not, again, you are vermicomposting. And then some resources on our end. So here is a photo actually of some kids drawing some superworms during one of our virtual education programming. So here again at Keep Austin Beautiful, we do free programming in partnership with Austin Resource Recovery for grades kindergarten through 12th. We talk about composting, recycling, zero waste. We have actually a children's book called Worm Pets, I think. And I have a PDF if for any reason you want that. It's actually a pretty easy to read guide on how to start a worm bin and how to take care of worms. And so it's actually a good resource. If anyone's interested, like we do have summer programming opportunities, so feel free again to reach out to me if that's something you'd be interested in. I can share this presentation with y'all too. I have some other kind of worm composting resources to refer to. We do have a blog on our site as well. And then I also have a couple of PDFs that I can link in this presentation, but they're kind of, one of them is like with the NC State ag kind of department. And it's a really great resource on vermicomposting and has more of those like really detailed specifics that I didn't necessarily talk about today. So I'm more than happy to like send resources y'all's way as well. My email is on a couple of other slides, and then I'm sure also Angel can link you to me. And yeah, so this is also just a little excerpt from our Worm Pets book. So again, it actually kind of talks about, you know, the worm bin, what we can feed our worms, and goes into greater detail there too, in case you're trying to involve a young one in this kind of production. And yeah, thanks. That's my email if anyone wants to reach out to me directly. And you can also, of course, go to our website if you have, you know, any interest in our education programming or anything else. Keep Austin beautiful. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Oh, okay, cool. Sorry, I did not see some of these messages in the chat. So I can go.
Yeah, we can go ahead and go through those. Let's start with Sanal's question. What type of paper, newspaper, cardboard are best for or good for composting?
Yeah, great question. So pretty much anything that's not, you know, you don't want like the glossy kind of like magazine material. Like you really want just your like black and white basic newspaper or cardboard. Again, that's like not kind of glossy, doesn't have any sort of like adhesive on the outside or like paint on the outside. That's also going to be fine to use. But again, you do want to kind of like tear that up or cut that up so it's like a suitable size for your bin and also allows for some airflow.
Okay. And Mary, she let us know that she has an extra worm factory. So if we wanted to do a surprise pop quiz, like a real surprise quiz on worm composting, I think that will be fun too. So if you want to think of a question after we answer these other questions. And the next one I saw was, what's the best way to store worm castings and how long can you keep the worm castings before they go bad? Or do they go bad?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. Like, I think definitely for me, like I'll just put my worm castings in like a jar or a bag or whatever and probably use them kind of within the year. But yeah, I can't give you like a solid answer on that. I've never had it like seem to go bad, but yeah, I don't know like how long those nutrients are going to be quite as effective.
I honestly put most of my worm castings in a bucket with a lid with rainwater, and I just constantly use it as a liquid fertilizer. I don't ever really put it in the ground as a thing, so I'm constantly putting it in there, and that works fantastically.
Okay, and then someone asked about the extreme hot heat in the summer. How can we help worms live through that kind of the summers in Texas?
Yeah, good question. So again, if you're outdoors, it's definitely manageable. I would say like the worm bin itself is going to actually self-regulate its temperature pretty well as long as it's got a lot of material in it. So if it's not quite at a point, like I showed that picture earlier and you saw like lots of, you know, soil in the bin. And so if it's not quite at that point where it's like really full, making sure that, you know, you have like solid layers of newspaper or straw or whatever bedding material you're using kind of around it so that it's sort of insulated. And then making sure that it's, you know, staying moist as well. And again, probably keeping it out of the direct sunlight is going to be best. Yeah, keeping it in the shade for sure. But the worms do, again, they like some warmth. So they're actually going to be pretty happy if it's like a little bit closer to that like 80-degree range. But after that, they might have a hard time.
Someone asked about the Blackfly larva. Are they bad for the compost?
Yeah, so the thing about the Blackfly larva is that they actually will change kind of like the temperature in the bin, which makes it like, unfortunately, like not habitable or as habitable for the worms. And so it's not exactly bad for the compost. Like they actually are great, like great composters. And I know there are plenty of resources out there on like actually how to compost with black soldier flies. But yeah, they're not going to make a happy habitat for your worms. They just are not going to work together.
Okay, and then Kathy asks, what's the ideal bin structure
Austin resource
for an outdoor vermicomposting setup? And they also ask kind of how best to protect from heat and cold, which
yeah, ideal bin structure and size. Again, I think some people are commenting in the chat too, sort of like the worm tower. That vertical structure is really cool because it's going to allow for some like separation of the castings from like what you're actually trying to compost. I would definitely say, yeah, sort of a larger structure is also going to be able to maintain or regulated temperature as well. But yeah, you can really do like varied ways. It's kind of your preference and how much like either energy you want to put into building something or money you want to spend on purchasing a system.
Okay, and someone asked about using coffee grinds. Like if you wanted to do an indoor bin that only used coffee grinds, is that something that worms, what about that?
Yeah, good question. I would say like, and some other folks in the room may have differing kind of like experiences with this. I've had some folks have success using coffee grounds. I personally have not used it because it tends to kind of change the like environment in the bin. And it makes it, yeah, kind of more sludgy, but I've had happy worms living in a compost ground worm composter before. It's not personally my preference, but I think it is pretty effective. You're again just going to have to trial and error it and maybe make sure that you use some more dry material or like more bedding to balance out the moisture in your bin. Yeah, and if anyone else has any thoughts on that, I'm happy to hear them too.
Catherine, kind of, it's more of a comment or she wants your thoughts. She recently watched a video where someone used PVC pipe buried vertically into the garden and used that with holes drilled into it for airflow and added scraps to the top. And she's curious what you think about that kind of design.
Interesting. Yeah, that definitely sounds really interesting and probably effective. I think I have my own reservations around using like PVC materials in like garden and soil that I'm using personally, but that does seem like it would probably work as long as there's enough airflow kind of throughout the structure.
Yeah, I think it's called a worm tower. Someone else made a comment about that. Let's see. Do we miss any of the other ones? Oh, rats. Question about rats.
Yeah, if rats invade your compost. Yeah, well, one thing I would say, like if you have an indoor or outdoor compost bin, like try to make sure that it's something that's going to close and kind of seal. So yeah, you don't necessarily have rats or raccoons or possums in there. Yeah, if rats invade your compost, I'm sure they would probably also try to eat the worms in there. So you may, Alexa, you may have to start over in that situation.
Absolutely have to exclude the rats. You've got to make a rat-proof container. Once they get going, there's no stopping them. The main thing I've learned about rats is that if you have a water source in your yard, water from your chickens, water from a pool, a pond, anything, they will stay because they really like, they have to have water to stay in a location.
Yeah, and Charlotte made a comment about other wildlife, about coyotes. Make sure that coyotes can't access, especially if you have a large outdoor, more passive pile setup. Yeah. Are there any other questions that that anyone has, or maybe we missed one in the chat?
Can you address mine, Angel?
Oh yeah, I missed that one. Let's see. Oh, I see. About the worm towers? No.
Yeah, I have like the buried worm kind of towers or worm stations in my garden as well. And I was just curious, how do you know how often to feed them versus kind of just let them do their thing? If you know any, it's like, can you overfeed them?
Yeah, good question. And also, yeah, again, like the California red wigglers in particular are not going to do as well in a garden bed, just because that's not, this Texas climate is not really their thing. So they sort of need a pretty contained, like insulated environment. But yeah, you can overfeed them if it's, in kind of a contained space. And just the way you're going to tell that is more so that, you're going to have a surplus of food. Maybe it's going to really kind of start smelling a little bit. It's just, yeah, I would say like you probably want to regularly feed them maybe about once a week. They can also go for like, if you have a lot of bedding in there, it can go for even like a month on its own. You can just kind of let them be. But depending on how much you're trying to feed the worms, I would say, start feeding them once a week, kind of see how they're doing with that material, and then you can add more or less as needed.
Okay, someone raised their hand. Let's see. Venus, yeah. So, Venus, do you want to ask your question?
Looks like it's quantity of worms needed.
Oh
yeah.
Subpod question. I don't know what subpod question is.
I think so. I would say depending on the size of your worm bin, again, I really go like for, I would say about half a pound of worms for like a 4-gallon kind of container, 4 to 5 gallon container. So depending, again, yeah, like the size of your bin, scaling up kind of with that ratio. And sometimes different sellers will sell by the pound or sell by like the number of worms. I think where I last ordered from, I got like 1,000 worms, and that was enough to put kind of comfortably in like 2 10-gallon containers. And so, yeah, like measure the volume of your space and then kind of scale accordingly.
And when you buy on the Jim's Worm site, they actually say how much you should get for, they give you a quote, approximate.
Yeah. I just didn't know if anybody had purchased a sub pod, which I already did. I was just trying to find out a quantity because I don't want to have too many or too little. So that's why I put on their sub pod question. She had asked if all the questions had been answered, and I did not hear my question being answered.
Oh, gotcha.
And then worm bags, what's the difference between them and a worm bin system?
Yeah, I've not used worm bags myself. I'm like looking it up right now. Laminated reclosable worm bags. So yeah, I'm not quite sure personally. I would say that, it may be like a little bit more flexible kind of in terms of the space versus like a hard structure. But yeah, sorry, don't know too much about that.
Does anybody else have any experience using the flexible bag system? No, I've just seen it in videos. It's fairly new. It seems like everything's going to this like bag, like grow bags and.
And then
they attach to like a PVC frame that you can build, and they drip. So, I would think you would want that indoors or in a shady area. I think it would be hard to keep them moist and cool.
Yeah. And then the next question is tumbling compost bins.
Yeah, I like the tumbling. I like the tumbling compost bin personally. It's not my preferred method. I would honestly just do like a backyard compost pile and turn it myself. Definitely what's nice about the tumbling compost bins is like it can fit on a back patio of an apartment. It's not super smelly. It's pretty low maintenance. I definitely have not figured out like the best way to harvest compost from the one I've used personally. So I would say it works fine for what it's made to do, but it's not my favorite.
Not for worms.
Yeah, no, not for worms.
Okay. And someone did ask about the ants, how to treat them. And I know you had mentioned kind of trying to move them away from the ant, where the ants mounds are trying to, or where the ants are trying to build their nest.
Yeah. I would say I don't know that much about treating fire ants. I would say, like you can dump boiling water on them, try to, kind of encourage them to move away with like by flooding them. But yeah, if you're trying to use like other organic methods, I don't know if anyone else has had really successful things with fire ants. They're kind of the worst, and maybe we just got to learn how to live with them.
Yeah,
I've actually never had ants invade a worm bin. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's pretty closed up. I don't know. Not accessible.
and someone shared that they knew a worm farmer. Yeah, feel free to drop that in the chat if anyone's interested. So there's a few tips too on dealing with fire ants in the chat. And so I think now would be a good time for that pop quiz for the worm. And Mary, do you want to talk about what the prize is a little bit?
Oh, the Bokashi or the tower?
The tower.
Okay. If you look up Worm 360 Tower, it's sort of a, 12 or 18 inch trays that fit on top of each other with a lid. And then at the bottom, it has sort of a spigot. And it's good for draining out the compost tea that comes with the worm bin. My worm bin is 4 feet by 4 feet. So that, so using the tower thing just wasn't that practical because my volume is large. And plus it dries out. So I would recommend it's functional. It works very well with the different layers and but it's a good thing you might want to use in a garage or a shed or someplace where it has a little more protection. And yeah, take the quiz if you want it.
All right. So Gabby, do you want to go ahead and give the pop quiz?
Yeah. Do you just want me to like ask a question and then someone just answers in the chat? I don't exactly know how this works.
The first person that answers in the chat will be the winner.
Okay. Can I ask a question that was not talked about in the presentation is my question.
Yes.
Okay.
I like, this is like super worm user.
So So my question is, like, how do worms breathe? Bobby got it.
Good job, Bobby.
I will say you will have to pick it up from my North Austin location. I can't mail it.
Oh, actually, Ramona got it. Thanks, Bobby. Ramona was even faster.
Because
Oh no, wait, there's someone named
you're right.
Sherry.
Oh, wow.
Sherry.
Oh, Sherry. No.
Oh, Sherry.
Wow. A lot of answers really quick. Okay, Sherry, are you good with picking it up in North Austin? I know we have some people dialing in from out of state.
Yes. She says yes. I'm in Round Rock. Oh, good, because you're near me then.
All right, good job, Sherry. So if you don't mind, I'm going to drop our email address in the chat, and you can just send us your info so we have that in case we need to contact you or coordinate anything, okay? All right. So next up, we have Kate, and we are going to be talking about Bokashi. So Kate, welcome. And Kate is joining us from San Antonio. She's representing the compost culture down there. So welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure. Can you all see that it's a presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank y'all so much for having me. This is exciting because it's actually our first workshop out of San Antonio. So thank you to Zoom and y'all for making that possible. And so, yeah, Bokashi, just a note on the word, we originally thought it actually was Japanese for fermented organic matter. It is not a literal translation, but it is sort of the word that has been used for this process starting in Japan. So I believe Bokashi actually means blur. So just a note on that. And then Compost Queen. So just my mom and I actually founded Compost Queens in February of 2017. We started off just doing residential curbside collection and then pretty quickly launched into commercial as well. San Antonio does have an organics green bin program for residents and single family households, but there's nothing for apartments or commercial businesses. So we also work with local farms and our clients to return the compost back to the earth through various methods that I'll talk about in the presentation. We educate about the importance of soil and compost. And since we started, we've diverted over 400,000 pounds from the landfill back into the community. I think it's a bit higher than that, but our record keeping at the beginning was not as great. So a brief history of Bokashi. So it was actually first recorded its use as a method in Korea, but then transferred to Japan, where farmers basically used microorganisms to ferment their scraps. They would bury it in soil, wait a few weeks, and they would get rich soil that they could then spread to other areas. And then in the 1980s, Dr. Teruo Higa was the one that really found and did the research related to what the optimum mix of the effective microbes, which are kind of known as EM, were for this fermentation process. Okay, so the benefits of Bokashi. So of course, when people think of composting, what we have found is the big turnoffs are that it smells bad, you get pests, and it can take a long time and a lot of work. So we really love that Bokashi takes a lot of that out of it. Because it's a fermentation process, it helps mitigate the odors. You don't get the really decaying smell or putrid smell you get with just decaying food. It helps control pests because the environment in which you are doing the bokashi, it's anaerobic, so pests cannot survive or thrive in that environment. And then it is a faster process through the fermentation. And then you can put almost all solid food waste in there. So meat, dairy, eggshells, seafood, cooked and raw foods, coffee grounds, coffee filters. It can pretty much all go into your container. Basically, the big no's are no liquid and no cooking grease or oil, because that will throw off the balance and the microbes won't be able to survive. And then there are some other uses for the bokashi flakes, which is it can be used as a chicken feed supplement or a probiotic for the soil. And then I'll talk about what the flakes consist of. But the process itself, so it's an anaerobic, it's really a pre-composting process, and it's converting organic matter into a soil amendment. So it's fermentation, not decomposition. So you put in the presence of these EM1, the lactobacillia, that help ferment the food scraps, so that then you can take those fermented food scraps and turn it into soil. So that food waste is the food source for the microbes, a lot like the worms we were talking about earlier. So what you need to do the process, you need bokashi flakes, you need an airtight container. So what we use just in our residential service is a 5-gallon bucket. And then we found some lids that really seal on really tight, because that's a big part of it. The bokashi bucket that they're giving away tonight has on it a spigot, which you won't see on our bucket. So I'll talk a little bit about what you can do with that spigot and the leachate. So you just need an airtight container, flakes, food scraps, and then somewhere to put the food scraps. And I'll talk about all those options. And then depending on what you're going to do with the food scraps at the end, you may need mulch or a shovel. So the flakes, they can be made out of a lot of things. So if you look it up on the internet, you can see people use wheat bran, rice, leaves, all kinds of dry grain, grass-like material. We use coffee chaff. So that's the byproduct of the coffee roasting process. We basically work with the local coffee roasters in San Antonio. They were already just throwing out their coffee chaff. Occasionally they'd put it out to gardeners. So we pick up that coffee chaff, put it through the fermentation process. We use the inoculant, the EM1. You can make your own, or you can purchase it. There's several companies online, that you can purchase the inoculant from. And then molasses and water. And that's what you mix together. You let it sit for a couple of weeks to ferment, and then you're going to dry it out. And then that's the flakes that you get there. And that's what you're going to add into your airtight bin. So the process itself, you're basically going to sprinkle a handful of the flakes to layer the bottom of whatever container you're using. Then you add 2 to 3 inches of food scraps. What we do at home is we have our own just little, bucket or bowl on the countertop as we are, prepping for meals and whatnot, chopping veggies. When that's full, that's when we'll add it to the bucket. So you've got a few inches of food scraps that you're throwing in there. And then once you add the food, you're just going to sprinkle another layer of the bokashi flakes, and then just repeat that process until the bucket's full. You can add something like newspaper to the bottom, which will aid in the liquid accumulation. Or if you've got the bucket, like the one with the spigot, you can drain off that liquid, and it's a very potent, like a compost tea. It does not have a shelf life to speak of, but if you dilute it, you can use it like a compost tea. And then some people will also just, when they're adding things, compress it down, like with a ceramic plate, just to get more of the air out. And then you just want to seal that lid tightly. Make sure whenever you are not adding food scraps, you have that lid on nice and secure. Once the bucket's full, or whatever your container is, you really want to just set it aside. The optimum time is 2 weeks to just ensure that everything in the container ferments. Now, it depends on how quickly it takes you to fill the container as well. So, you know, a family of 4 or 5 might fill it a lot more quickly than one person. So that one person's bucket may be mostly fermented by the time they get to the top. So you can kind of judge it by, you know, the smell. And then there's some things like this, like you can see this white mold in this picture here. That is a really great sign that the fermentation process is active. You're not always going to get the mold, but it is a great sign. And then you can see here, there's a picture with some maggots. Some people, you know, weren't keeping their lid closed tightly. So that can happen if you're not watching that lid. So again, yeah, air is the enemy. White mold in the bucket is great. If you see black or like a green or blue mold, that means air is getting in your bucket. You're not sealing it tightly enough. If you've got maggots and other, you know, bugs, again, air got in. If it smells really, really bad, you probably have not added enough flakes. And that's just a balance you kind of have to learn. When we started, I think we definitely went heavier on the flakes. Most people do. Definitely when we add, you know, a lot of meat, or I've added, you know, a bunch of shrimp shells, I will add more flakes just to kind of ensure that that fermentation really is taking hold. And then what to do with the finished product. So you've been collecting the food scraps, you've been layering it with the flakes, you've let it ferment. You've got a few options, kind of depending on what your space is, what you've got around you, how much work you want to put in, etc. But, you know, you can dig a hole, add to an existing compost, enrich your garden beds, fertilize fruit trees, or feed some livestock. And I'll talk about how to do each of those. So one of the most straightforward ways to do this is just dig a hole in your garden, empty those fermented scraps, cover it up. After 2 weeks, you're going to have just really incredible soil there because it breaks down incredibly fast. The things you may see are eggshells, bones if they're in there. The things that typically take longer to break down are still going to take a little bit longer to break down, but there's no harm in them being there. So we have customers that just have a hole that's their continual basically source of soil. So they bury it, cover it, unbury it, bury the next bucket, and then they just collect their soil somewhere else. This is also a way that you can over time just amend the soil in your yard and just really increase all of the, you know, benefits of really healthy soil in your yard. If you have an existing compost pile or compost bin, you can certainly add the fermented food scraps. You just want to make sure, again, that there's the presence of soil, because what's happening once you've got the fermented food scraps and you introduce them to the soil microbes, they're going to feast on the food scraps and those bokashi microbes that are in there. They just become a buffet for the soil microbes. So you really need the presence of some kind of carbon source, mulch, or soil. And that's also going to help make sure that you're not going to have any sort of rodents disturbing it. You know, you just want to make sure it's really incorporated well, but you're going to find that it breaks down much faster even in your compost pile. And then you can add it directly to a garden bed. So, you know, we work with community gardens and other, you know, large and small spaces. And so when they're getting ready to come to planting season and prepare new beds, we just dig a trench, line out the buckets, cover them up. And again, it'll break down really fast. The other part of this is you do want to wait the 2 weeks before planting because the contents of the bucket are incredibly acidic. And so once you add it to the soil, the pH will balance out pretty quickly, but you want to give it a little bit of time to do that. So again, just cover it well with soil and let the, you know, microbes all get to work. And then in the garden, when you have more established plants, like, so this is a beautiful orange tree that we actually just lost in a freeze. But before that, we had done this, you know, periodically. We just, you know, spread out food scraps, cover it really well. And over the next couple of seasons, just saw the, you know, the yield increase exponentially. So as long as it's a well-established tree, you can add the scraps near the root bed. But if it's a new one, you really want to give it some space because of the acidity. And then we've worked with farmers who will feed it to their chickens. One farmer that would feed it to his chickens and his goats. And then if there's anything left, he actually had a black soldier fly system that he would then add it into, because as was mentioned, black soldier flies are incredible decomposers and will decompose anything you put in front of them pretty quickly. So that was just an aside. But you can feed the scraps to the chickens. The caveat there is to avoid a lot of coffee grounds, because of the caffeine level is something to, just be aware of. So again, I've touched on this. How long does the process take? If you've really allowed the contents of your bin to ferment, a good 2 weeks, it can decompose within a matter of 1 to 3 weeks. A lot of that can depend on the contents of the bucket. So if it's all veggies and fruit scraps, that's going to compost a lot faster than, eggshells and things like that. And then just a little bit, this has been touched on, why it matters, why we need organic matter in the soil, because our soil is an ecosystem and it needs to be healthy for plants to thrive. You need the microbes to help the plants, and vice versa. The plants help the microbes for all kinds of reasons. When we have healthy soil, it helps retain moisture. It helps, avoid erosion. We don't need as many, pesticides or fertilizers. So there's just a lot of reasons that we want to increase the presence of organic matter in the soil. And then what bokashi food scraps bring to it is just another level of nutrients, a more diverse microbial life, and that it helps improve the soil structure more and increase that water holding capacity. And we just love to sort of share this quote by Wendell Berry: "The soil is the great connector of lives, the source and destination of all. It is the healer and restorer and resurrector, by which disease passes into health and age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we have no community, because without proper care for it, we can have no life." So just to briefly touch on soil health, when we have the degraded soil that we talked about at the very beginning of the meeting, you see erosion, you see extreme weather, drought, flood, pests, and disease. And when you add more life to the soil through things like bokashi composting, you just, you have more beneficial microbes doing the work and helping the process along. So we do, this is just how to find us. We sell our kits and bokashi flakes primarily in San Antonio. Our flakes are available online for shipping. The kits at this time are not, but we do sell them locally at a few places in San Antonio, and we can sell the flakes bulk if somebody was interested in that as well. And then this is primarily made for our San Antonio audience, but just so y'all know, we do our composting service. We have drop-off locations all over San Antonio, as well as a monthly pickup service in the surrounding area. We do workshops and consultations on composting. We do have a soil enrichment service. So even if you're not working with us on the bokashi, you can have us come and amend your soil with bokashi food scraps. And if you're a community garden, once we do a demonstration, we donate the food scraps to amend the soil. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I'm sure there are some questions. I can't really see the chat box from here, but yeah, I can stop sharing.
So there's a few questions that popped up. Danielle asked about if things are already moldy, how does that compete with the fermentation process, or can that mess up the fermentation?
So we have certainly added some, moldy strawberries here and there. If it is not a large portion of what's going in the bin, then the healthy microbes are going to win out. If you don't want to, fill your bin with a lot of already moldy food, because that's going to kind of be a lot of competition.
Okay.
So if air gets in, maggots and blue and black mold, is it detrimental to the whole batch and fermentation process, or just annoying mostly because of the pests?
Yeah. So the maggots, it's just annoying. I mean, it's just, it grosses people out. They don't want to deal with it. It's not, in that case, I mean, you just close it back up and they're not going to keep thriving. And then the blue and the black mold, it really kind of depends on how it's overtaken a bin. But it can usually, if you're checking your bin, relatively frequently, it can usually be corrected pretty well just by adding more flakes, keeping the air out, and letting it sit for a bit.
Where do you keep your bucket or bin?
Yeah, so mine sits right outside of my back door. Some people do keep it inside. I will say that, once you've had food scraps in there a while and you open it, there's a smell that is fermentation. It's not just, nothing. So, but it'll go away once you close the bin, typically, depending on your bin. So some people do keep it just right there in their kitchen. So it's very easy. And that's just where all the food scraps go directly. It's really a space and preference thing. It can certainly sit outside though.
Can you talk about how people use the spigot or make like a tea?
Sure. So that is actually, we have not done that as much. So there's a lot more research on the internet, but it is, my understanding is it is just a lot like a compost tea. It's a very strong leachate. So you really want to dilute it significantly. We have read some reports that it can be used to clear pipes in a septic tank or to deal with algae in ponds. We have not tested that, so I'm not going to say that that's a definitive use, but there's a lot out there about what it can be used for beyond just compost tea.
All right. Were there any other questions that we missed?
Something about frozen. Can you put frozen scraps in?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, frozen scraps. So that's just sort of a preference. We're coming up on the season where I would recommend that you may want to freeze your food scraps if you're not going directly in the bucket, because fruit flies are ever present. There's nothing wrong with putting frozen food scraps into the bucket. That's fine.
Okay. That is the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I just saw to make your own bucket. So you need an airtight container and an airtight lid. We had to really look to source the buckets, and we have to buy the lids. I'm sorry, the lids. We get our buckets, they're 5-gallon paint buckets from Lowe's, I believe. But the lids we had to source and buy in bulk. But I think even if you have a lid on something that's not super airtight, some people will just put sort of like a sheet or something sort of, and then put the lid on it to sort of help create a seal. So you just want to experiment and make sure. You could probably use other kinds of bins. We do use 40-gallon barrels for our commercial clients, but that, as you can imagine, gets quite heavy.
Mm-hmm. Kim asked about making your own flakes. It seems like it's quite an industrial process, especially if you're needing a lot, but is it something if someone had a dehydrator?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you need the base product. So, I recommend, of course, try to find something you're gonna divert from the landfill. So go to a local coffee roaster, ask if they have chaff. Some people use spent grains from breweries. You do need to dry that out before the process. So it's just an added step, but there's I think I've heard of shredded cardboard. So you need that base, and then you need the inoculant, which you can make yourself. It's pretty Googleable online, but you can also buy bottles of the inoculant. There's a company called Terraganics that we used to get it from before we made our own. And then you just need water and molasses. So yeah, it's up on the internet. You can find the recipe. And it's, you probably could do it. I mean, some people just do it on their own. A 5-gallon bucket, you know, of the flakes will last you quite a long time. So we sell 5-quart bags and that'll last you several months. So it's a little bit of the flakes go a long way.
Nice. I saw a few posts that you all shared on social media of people using like the bokashi with like bluebonnets or different plants and getting like really crazy results. Can you talk a little bit about like some experiences people have had where they've had like super growth of their vegetables or plants?
Sure. So the bluebonnets actually were from our front yard. In the fall, I buried about 3 buckets with the intention of planting some vegetables. That did not ever happen. But we had a big patch of larkspur and some bluebonnets come back, and they are just quite large this year. And I was realizing that it's right along that line where I buried the buckets. And then also, if you look on our social media, we have one customer who had us come out and they put in they have a really big backyard. So they put in just straight into the ground several rows. And so we emptied buckets into it. And that was about a year ago, I'd say. And right now, I mean, they're harvesting and we've been posting, they share it with us. So we've been posting it, but I mean, a fennel that was almost as big as my head. Right now, there's a post about this kale that they're growing that's just some of the biggest kale I've ever seen. So it's just, they're getting really incredible yields from it. So we think it's pretty great.
And I'm guessing there's probably been studies, since it goes back to the 80s, I'm sure that there's been studies done that if someone were interested, they could dig into some Google Scholar papers.
Yes.
So it looks like people are having trouble finding the proper buckets with lids that work. And when you bury the product, are animals attracted to it? Do you have to cage them out?
So I'll talk about the animals first. As long as you cover it well, they should stay away. We have had very little report or experience with disturbance in our beds. So we do community gardens all over town. We've done, my pretty much entire front yard at some point has had bokashi added to it. And as long as you've got a good, as long as you can't see any of the food scraps, once you've covered it, you should be fine. And can't smell it yourself, you should be fine. And then the lids, so we have had to we have to buy them in bulk quantity from like a wholesale, from Uline. So we do sell them on our website, but it's been a lot of trial and error. We had to do a lot of trial and error for a long time. So as far as finding the lids, I don't have a magical answer. I think that's why, the bins are being produced specifically for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So do we have a quiz?
Yes.
The pop quiz is got their keyboards ready to the first to answer. So to state the prize again, we have a bokashi bin donated from the Compost Coalition, which is an Austin-based group of compost and activists, enthusiasts that work on different projects throughout Austin. And we also will be sending the winner some flakes to get their bokashi going. So, all right, so let's get ready for the question.
Okay, so what from your kitchen cannot go in the bokashi bin?
Okay.
Oh, it's coming in fast.
Wow.
So the first correct answer was Charlotte with grease. You can actually put meat in the bin, but you
Charlotte.
cannot put grease or cooking oil. So.
Okay, so Charlotte. Okay.
All right. So Charlotte, if you could just send us your mailing address to the Austin Organic Gardener email, and I'll send that to you in case you don't have it.
Are we going to have them pick it up? Because it's too big to mail.
Oh yeah, I guess we could maybe just have it sent to the flakes sent to your house that go with it, and then either way.
Yeah, I'm happy to mail the flakes directly to Charlotte if that's easier.
Yeah, and then we can have Charlotte. You'll have to pick up the bin at Mary's house, and we'll figure out the logistics on email. Okay. Well, that was a lot of fun, everyone. Are there any other questions tonight?
Thank you guys so much for coming, and it was great to have a good visit and get some great information. And we look forward to next month's topic, gardening naturally for pests.
Yes.
Pest-free gardening, something like that.
It's a pest-free organically.
Organically, that's very nice.
Like a little alliteration.
Yes, and again, if you want to buy bat guano, it's a benefit for our club, a fundraiser. It's on the website under events, bat guano, and it's $5 for a pound, and it's a great nitrogen fertilizer.
Yeah. All right. Well, it was great to see everyone. Thanks for tuning in. And we'll see you all next month. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.